Production of this program was made possible in part by the Alabama Architectural Foundation. The Alabama State Council on the Arts, and by KPS Group.
You see, we just wanted a house a little larger than the Jacobs house when we started. We had no reality about what we required. We just didn't know. We were newly married before we had children. We didn't know what was required. We were just babes in the wood.
Frank Lloyd Wright's Rosenbaum house is the best example of his Usonian style, and the only one of Wright's houses that is still occupied by its original owner, Mimi Rosenbaum. Usonian, a term coined by English satirist Samuel Butler, was originally used to refer to anything relating to the United States of America. Wright adopted the word to describe a series of practical, affordable residences designed for average Americans living in small towns and suburbs. The Rosenbaum house is one of 26 Usonian houses in the United States, and it is the only structure in Alabama designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. In 1948, the Rosenbaums expanded the house, with the addition also designed by Wright. The original house and the addition reflect Wright's organic concept of using natural, locally available materials such as cypress, glass, and brick, and the avoidance of paint and plaster. With only minor changes for restorative purposes, the house is maintained as it was designed and built in 1939.
I think Frank Lloyd Wright would have liked the fact that his colleagues would call him the premier American architect, because I think he probably thought of himself that way. I think in order to do good architecture, and certainly to do it on the scale that he did it and the style that he did it, that you have to have a lot of belief in yourself. And if you don't have a little arrogance, I don't think you're very successful in doing that kind of thing. I think the house is very important to Alabama because it represents in a very pure and sophisticated stylistic way a lot of things that happened in social history through the Tennessee Valley, and a lot of things that happened as far as architecture in 20th century Alabama. I also think it's very interesting that the house kind of fits a Southern stereotype in that we think of, people living in the family home and still living out in Greene County in the antebellum plantation. It's in the original family, and here's a great house designed by a great architect and still being inhabited by the original family. It's a real legacy that the Rosenbaums have left this state, to have taken the time to record the history of the building of the house, to write a book about the house, for Ms. Rosenbaum herself to be giving tours of the house to the general public. It's an experience that you have of seeing the house and hearing the original stories that you really don't have. There's no documentary history to be done here. Mrs. Rosenbaum is the history. There's a great restoration preservation architect in Huntsville, Harvey Jones, who has helped them with some of the projects working on the house and some of the repairs on the house. And he said to me over the telephone, "I'm just not accustomed to having the builder of the house there to tell me what went on. I'm used to having to do research. I'm used to having to hunt. I'm used to having to go through documents. But there she is, the living history of that house, still here to talk to us about it." It's a very exciting tour to take.
During the years preceding the Second World War, a massive federal construction project known as the Tennessee Valley Authority began to change the landscape of the Florence and Muscle Shoals area. Locks and dams were built to garner electricity and control the flow of water in the region. This project was meant to stimulate development and provide economic opportunities in North Alabama, as well as other states in the region. The area was rich in natural resources, such as nitrates, potash, and phosphate for munitions and fertilizers, coal, iron ore, and manganese for steelmaking, asphalt and limestone for roads and buildings. Industrialists and entrepreneurs such as Henry Ford and Thomas Edison visited Muscle Shoals with the intention of developing auto assembly and electrical plants. These events, and the prospect of a paying client, prompted Frank Lloyd Wright to design a residence for Stanley and Mimi Rosenbaum. Frank Lloyd Wright was 72 years old when he was approached by the newly married Rosenbaums to create their home in Florence, Alabama. The site was a 2-acre plot of land overlooking the Tennessee River. The land and the money to build a home were a wedding gift from Stanley's parents, who lived in a house directly across the street. The couple's choice of Frank Lloyd Wright and his bold, revolutionary architectural style proved to be daring and controversial. Wright was the world's foremost architect and had built such masterpieces as the Roby and Dana Thomas houses in Illinois, the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, Japan, and Falling Water in western Pennsylvania.
What you have really in this part of Wright's legacy is his building what he called a Usonian house. That is to say, a house for every man. And here is really one of the very best of all of Wright's Usonian houses across the country. It's here in North Alabama, but it's one of the best anywhere. It is maybe the only one that 60 years after it's constructed is still lived in by Wright's own client. And Mimi Rosenbaum can tell you about talking with Frank Lloyd Wright about designing and building this house, and in some ways, even more importantly, about designing and building an addition to this house for her own family, for her kids. This house grew, and I think this may be the only one of the Usonian houses that was expanded on by Wright himself for a family that had grown up in the house. And now here it is 60 years later, still being lived in by Mrs. Rosenbaum, and she has been there every day for the history of the house. That's a remarkable tale, and one certainly that I think Wright would himself probably get a kick out of, because he was trying to design this house for a family. This was a particular client, and he designed it for this family, and he knew them. And clearly the relationship between the Wrights and the Rosenbaums was a lively affair, and they corresponded, and in fact they visited. As I understand, the Rosenbaums were in Arizona at Taliesin and visited there, and Wright drew, in fact, the plans for the addition with the Rosenbaums in the room, looking over his shoulder. What a great story that is. So here you have in many ways, the lion of American architecture, designing a house that is not meant to be a great house. It's meant to be a house for every man. And yet he has a real client involved. He knows the client, and the client's still living in the house 60 years later. That's a great, great story. It's going to be, I think, therefore, in answer to your original question, in some ways really an important part of the Wright legacy, because here is a saga that it stretches out way past Wright's death. And keeps the house alive. And if I could turn for a moment to the preservation side, one of the things that this house will preserve is not just bricks and mortar, but one of the things that this house will preserve and this project will preserve is this story of the relationship between the Rosenbaums as the client and Frank Lloyd Wright, and also the wonderful part of the story of how did a family living in North Alabama come in 1938-39 to commission Frank Lloyd Wright to build them a house. That's a wonderful tale, and it will be preserved as part of this project. That's a great piece of it because it's a story. It's a real human family story, not just a pile of wonderfully assembled building materials. It's a lot more than that.
The modern Usonian house was a radical departure from the traditional colonial, antebellum, and Victorian structures that dotted the Florence landscape in the years prior to World War II. The Usonian style personified Wright's organic philosophy that a structure should be of the earth, not on the earth. In 1938, Frank Lloyd Wright completed the Usonian prototype for the Jacobs family in Madison, Wisconsin. The Jacobs and Rosenbaum houses were the first dwellings to employ Wright's radical ideas for organic domestic architecture. The structures incorporated the first carport, the first use of radiant heating and curtain walls, and a multi-level cantilever roof. The use of all natural materials, outside access to every room, and elevations that follow the contours of the site. According to Wright, a house is more of a home by being a work of art. In his organic dwellings, each element, walls, windows, and doors, furnishings, light fixtures, and hardware were integral parts of the structure. Wright believed in the unity of architecture and nature, incorporating the surrounding landscape into the design of the house.
Usonian architecture was what he called a kit of parts. It was a building system that permitted houses to go up cheaply, and once they were built, to be added to, subtracted from, and changed according to the family need. My parents, when they built their house in 1940, were a young couple. 7 years later, they had 4 children, and the house was added to. In the late 1960s, when all of us had gone off to school and out of the house changed again and was remodeled in many ways. The bunk beds were taken out and bookshelves were put in, and other adaptations suitable to that time and era.
I first visited the Rosenbaum house in, I think it was 1953, as a student. We went there, a group of about 5 or 6 of us with a faculty member, to experiment in how do you convey the sense of a building and its spaces to someone who cannot go to and in that building. And we used film and models and drawings and several experimental methods to try to convey this. When Frank Lloyd Wright was young, and incidentally, he never studied architecture. He studied in college civil engineering, I think, for 2 semesters and dropped out to work for the famous architect Louis Sullivan in Chicago. Sullivan was also an extremely talented architect, but of course, his work does not look like Wright's later work. And in fact, the early work that Wright did for Sullivan was not nearly as daring as what he would do later on. He was just a young kid. He was learning how to do architecture, but it was still highly competent work, and he quickly rose to be the head of Louis Sullivan's office. In the process of working for Louis Sullivan and sharpening his skills as a young architect, he started doing some houses for Sullivan, and also he started doing some houses for himself on weekends and nights. And he constantly experimented, and he developed his style in the very early years. There were also other architects, however, working in the prairie style. So Wright sharpened his skills as an architect in general and began to develop what later became known as the prairie style. Now, Wright also associated with many other young architects in Chicago, and Wright certainly was not the only architect who practiced in the prairie style. There were many of them, and many were fine architects, but Wright, of course, was by far the most talented and the most experimental of the prairie style architects.
I'm always excited to see architects, and specifically Frank Lloyd Wright, thinking about how to provide quality living spaces for regular people, for ordinary middle-class people. It's a real challenge, because I think what we learn many times in architecture school is how to spend your client's money. It's easy to think about enriching things, and you can always think of a greater material or a more exciting thing you can do, and it just cost a couple of $100,000 more. And I think Mr. Wright sort of fell victim to this, because a lot of the wonderful natural materials he loved to use became more expensive and more expensive at the time. Although the plywood used in the Rosenbaum house was a relatively inexpensive material at the time, it's become, with expensive veneers, a very expensive building material. And clear finishes are more expensive to put on than paint. There are a lot of things that sort of put Mr. Wright's ideas about design out of the league of a lot of people. But a lot of the ideas that he had about the use of space have carried over into our modern residential development. We built houses with low hip roofs, even though they had nothing to do with the prairie style, for many years after Mr. Wright had gone on to other things. We changed our ideas about how we feel about interior space and exterior space all being one. We all have a deck or a porch or things that we use. Views to the outside are much more valued. Windows have gotten bigger. We changed the idea about having to have a separate room for everything. We may still, in our new houses, have a separate living and dining room, but we live in the great room. We eat in the great room. The family kitchen connects to the great room, and this idea of one large living space is something that Mr. Wright pioneered.
The Stanley and Mildred Rosenbaum house was completed in 1940. As the Rosenbaum family grew to include 4 boys, the house was enlarged by Wright to include 2 new wings, which were completed in 1948. This was an essential part of Frank Lloyd Wright's philosophy: suitable, adaptable living space incorporating the home, nature, and the family unit.
Froebel blocks were invented by a German educator to use in kindergartens, and they were a myriad of geometric shapes, not so much three-dimensional as almost two-dimensional. But they also had any number of, well, every geometric shape almost that you can think of, and you could put them together to form patterns in various ways. And so Wright, later on in his life, always said that these Froebel blocks were a great influence on his early childhood. And you can look at his houses and see that, that he used basic geometric shapes of all sorts in his houses, including decorative elements. Like in the Rosenbaum house, there are some planks with geometric cutouts in them to where light would come through that he used in the clear-story windows. And the basic geometry of the blocks perhaps had an influence on the kind of architect he became, and maybe not, because I think he would have become a great architect if he had never seen a Froebel block.
One of the ideas behind the Usonian houses was something that I think Mr. Wright called automobility, the fact that we were all going to have cars. Henry Ford had come up with a car that any man could afford. It only cost a couple of $100s, and that we could afford to go anywhere and live anywhere we wanted to do. And he saw these houses in the prairies as something I think uniquely American, and something that we could all have our cars. And in some ways it's one of the things that spurred the kind of suburban development, this improvement in transportation, and it was something that Mr. Wright looked forward to tying into his sort of whole universal concept for how people lived.
In the Usonian houses, Wright devised the Usonian houses in the 1920s and 30s, and his objective was to have a small, simple house that the average middle-class family could afford. In fact, the Rosenbaum house is a Usonian house, and obviously was one of Wright's favorites because it crops up in nearly every book on Usonian houses I've ever seen. But this house was of the earth, low and spreading in the prairie school manner, and was originally L-shaped.
My sister wrote to me from Cincinnati and asked if I wouldn't mind a blind date with a young man she met in Florence, Alabama. His name is Stanley Rosenbaum. I didn't know what to expect, but anyway, he was up for a 3-week holiday to see museums and plays on Broadway. Well, cutting classes, and I did accompany him on these various things. And he said goodbye after the 3 weeks and came back to Florence. I hadn't heard from him in 3 years. And 3 years later, he came to New York for a whole year to do research on a book that he was writing, and on the Jews that he had met in English literature. He was an English major at Harvard. He was 7 years older than I. Well, anyway, when he came back, I was 20 years old, and he started seeing me again. And it turned into romance. And at the end of the year, he really gave me the idea that he wanted to marry me. His parents came up from Florence, Alabama to meet me, and I met them all, and it was all very agreeable and very lovely. I had no idea the extension of Florence life, that sort of thing. Living in the South was an experience in itself, coming from New York City. And, but anyway, I looked forward with interest. When I was 21, my husband 28, we married. And after a long wedding trip, I came here to Florence to see it for the first time. While we were unpacking, and it was in the house across the street, his parents came to us as we were unpacking and said that they were going to give us $7,500 to either buy a house or build a house as a wedding present. My husband, being an only child, thought this was really a wonderful start for us in life. Well, coming from New York City, I lived in an apartment house all my life and had no idea of what houses were all about. And so we called on a friend of ours I had met in New York because he was studying architecture and design at Cooper Union in New York. His name is Aaron Green. And Aaron had just discovered Frank Lloyd Wright and was very enthusiastic about him. And so he transferred all this enthusiasm to us, and he gave us two things to read. One was Mr. Wright's autobiography, which he wrote in 1932, and the other thing was Architectural Forum of January 1938, where Mr. Wright came out with his ideas of Usonian homes. In Architectural Forum, we found a house that Mr. Wright did in Madison, Wisconsin, the Jacobs House, and that was built for $5,000. When we first came here, my parents-in-law said, if you're going to build a house, we'd love for you to live right across the street. And so my father-in-law brought us 2 lots here facing the Tennessee River. It's called Riverview Drive because of it. And there was nothing built on either side of us. It was undeveloped land. Anyway, our friend said, why don't you write to Mr. Wright and ask him for a house like the Jacobs House? We were hesitant after reading his autobiography. We saw that Mr. Wright was a volatile man, and it wasn't easy to get along with. And so we shifted the responsibility of writing to Mr. Wright, asking him for a house for us. Aaron Green wrote to Mr. Wright, and it didn't get a reply until 1939. When he answered us, he said, I'll be glad to do a house for you, which was what we were waiting for very patiently. Meanwhile, the household was taken care of by my parents-in-law across the street. They had no other children, and they treated me as a daughter. They were just wonderful to me. Well, we had our friend decided, his name is Aaron Green, he decided not to go back to school that fall and to stay in Florence and help supervise the building of this house.
It's interesting to think about Frank Lloyd Wright sitting in Arizona, looking at Muscle Shoals and sort of projecting a little bit onto Wright. And you do that at your peril. Frank Lloyd Wright doesn't bear a lot of projecting onto, but clearly here is Muscle Shoals the very centerpiece of the TVA, something that he has thought about, as it turns out, quite a lot. He's thought about the TVA in particular, but he's also thought generically about building a Broadacre City and the relationship with Henry Ford, and that whole story forms a very deep, if you will, cultural backlog. And I don't mean to be fancy about that, but this is a complicated setting. This is a house which Wright has in mind ultimately of transforming into a factory-built system of housing. He's talking about Muscle Shoals, where we're generating electricity to revive a whole part of the economy. I find it fascinating because my own grandfather used to work for the TVA, although in Asheville, North Carolina. But nonetheless, I sort of grew up with some TVA stories across the dining room table. And then you have the role of Henry Ford looking at Muscle Shoals at much the same time, and here is the father of the mass-produced automobile. There's a series of overlays of different kinds of perceptions of what's going on in Muscle Shoals from a number of different angles. And here come the Rosenbaums saying, won't you design us a house? And this is a very sophisticated, highly educated client who has learned of Wright from the publications, the Henry Luce publications, in fact, of his Usonian houses. And they go and seek him out and say, we are interested in what it is we know about you and what you're trying to accomplish. And there's a match between our family and this house and this region and your style and what's going on in Muscle Shoals, in Florence, may be interesting. So you have to think that Wright, on the one hand, said, I'm glad to get a client in the late 1930s. That's a good thing for an architect. But this is an interesting one. This isn't just build me a house, but this is build me a house in a particular place in which I have a very considerable interest. And the way I think about it and what I want to try to accomplish here may be particularly significant. Now, you know, in hindsight, it turns out that was really true. What was on Frank Lloyd Wright's mind when he's sitting in Scottsdale and is approached by all of this, I would never hazard a guess. But you think it probably pretty interesting conjunction of forces.
Anyway, we had great times in the house. We had lots and lots of visitors from visiting groups. We were the place that when a concert was in town, the performers would come here, or when there was a lecture or distinguished visitors at TVA, they would come to the house. Interestingly, in the 50s, when there were no integrated facilities in Florence, and an integrated group of students would come from Vermont, Putney, Vermont. One group would come each year. They would sometimes stay in sleeping bags in our house because there were no accommodations for African Americans here in Florence. So it was varied and exciting, and a great deal more interesting people that we saw here in Florence, Alabama than we would probably have seen growing up in New York City. So our house was really defined by the people who occupied it and by the people who visited it. I remember thinking that my father's library was really what held the house up. That in a certain way it's a very fragile house, but it really was the imagination, I think, of my parents and of my father's books and of the conversation that filled the rooms and kept the roof from falling in.
So we got $7,500 just put into an account for us to draw on. And when we exhausted the $7,500 and hadn't completed the house, we found that we needed more money. And some friends got together and supplied the money for us to finish it. We ourselves didn't own anything. We were young and starting out. We had no collateral. And we didn't want to go back to my parents-in-law for more money. And we called on FHA to come and help us out. And they couldn't determine whether this was a frame house or a masonry house. They had no category to put it in. And so they turned us down. And they said, besides which, it wouldn't sell. So, for resale. Mr. Wright was not very well known then in this country. They knew about him more in Europe than they did here. Anyway, these friends got together and pooled their money, and we were able to finish the house. It ended up costing $12,000. But it contained Mr. Wright's furniture, which he designed for us. The only thing we owned was a piano, because I was a music major in college. And that's the only thing that we had that we could put into this living room. And so Mr. Wright did every bit of the furnishings.
Wright was one of the first people to, well, first of all, he was very favorable to the idea of family and democracy and humanity, humaneness, if you want to call it that. So his houses and other buildings tried to hug the earth and become part of the earth. I mentioned that he used earth tones in the exteriors and interiors of his house. His houses ideally were of the earth, not on the earth. That's a quote from Wright. So as part of this and the idea of family, he wanted to do everything possible in the houses to bring the family together. So he made spaces where for instance, the wife was not isolated in the kitchen. She was there with the family in the evenings. And the outdoors was right there. You could see it through these glass walls they had in the back. And since they were glass, obviously he put them on the back so you would have privacy as well as becoming closer to nature through the glass. So all of his things were done for reasons. And the basis of his philosophy was, he called it organic. His architecture was organic, and that means of the earth, not on the earth, of the family, not on the family, you might say. He did everything he could to make life pleasant for the people who lived in these buildings, and if you go into one, you'll see precisely, without any words from me, exactly how he did it and that he did do it.
The house was given to us in the form of a check. And we had this money to go out and purchase materials and labor and what have you. Mr. Wright, in his letter accepting this task of building us a house, said he didn't believe in contractors then. He said they didn't quite understand what I was trying to do, he said. And he said that he was going to send one of his apprentices who would supervise the building of the house. Aaron Green, our friend, decided not to go back to New York and stay here to help supervise the building of the house. And when they finished, incidentally, the apprentice's name was Burton Goodrich. When he finished with his job here, both boys went to Taliesin. Aaron Green to present himself to Mr. Wright. And Mr. Wright took him on the spot as a scholarship student to work with the group. But anyway, since it took so long to build a house, we had to locate the cypress, and we had an unusual, it was a flat roof. Well, roofs, R-O-O-V-E-S, 5 different levels of them. And the reason for that being the fact that we had to build according to the contours of the land. As the land slopes, the house slopes by means of steps throughout. The original roof was a poured-on roof made out of concrete and horsehair. And they poured it on. Well, all this took a very long time to try to do this in wintertime and during the cold weather because things would freeze up. Incidentally, outside all every room are 2 by 4 foot doors, 2 by 2 foot wide doors that open to a 4 foot space. The house is built on a module of 2 by 4 feet. It's built on this grid, and this grid is followed out throughout the house. The doors open to a 4 foot space, 2 foot doors. They open casement-wise, and it follows the lines of the ceiling that are 2 by 4 foot panels that go across the whole room. And you'll find that the design of the clerestories above there are 4 foot wide, and it goes all across the room to 4 feet in the lights over my head and 4 feet in the transom beneath it.
I think in many ways that Mr. Wright, as an architect, broke out of the box of formalized spaces and gave architects new ways of thinking about space and new directions to go. It was no longer just completely a formal organization of space, but people were really allowed for the first time to think of things in completely different ways. I think it's led to a lot of developments in architecture that maybe would have been stymied had he not really been the one who came up with these fresh new ideas and said, we can do this a different way.
In any building project, the architect first obtains what is called a topographic survey that a civil engineer would do. A topographic survey, as the name implies, shows the slopes of the land, and it also shows features like trees or rocks or streets or sewer lines or water lines or whatever is there. So that's a basic tool that an architect starts with, but the major basic tool is he has to know this family that wants to build this house. What are their plans and plans for the future? What do they need right now? What is their budget? Where is the site? Where does the sun travel through the sky in the winter and the summer? That's very important. Where are the prevailing breezes coming from? Where's the shade? There are hundreds of factors that need to be taken into play before you set one line on paper, and this is true for any architect. And Wright did this superbly. For instance, the Rosenbaum house hugs the ground. The site slopes to the rear, so the house, the floors, and the roofs step down as you go down the hillside. This hugging the ground is not just some academic thought. It makes the house part of the ground and makes it more beautiful. It also makes opportunities for bringing in light in the upper part of many of the rooms, and of course in that day they didn't have air conditioning. Also ventilation. It made ventilation better. The Rosenbaum house is never more than 1 room deep, so you could have windows open on 2 sides of a room, a minimum of 2 sides, and get cross breezes through. That was extremely important in the days before air conditioning, as you can imagine. So the architect tries to take all of these factors into account, and then you start making sketches, and you sketch one thing and you see, well, that doesn't quite work, or I'm not suited with that, and you make more sketches. And then periodically you get with the owner, and get the owner's input on it. The architect doesn't sit in his ivory castle and say, here's the finished design, go build it. It's a teamwork effort, and Wright was certainly a teamwork architect. You might think that he would sit in his ivory castle, but not at all. He was very friendly with and concerned with his clients and worked very, very closely with them to try to get them a good house that suited them as well as suited his architectural aspirations.
Usonian house, and this is really sort of the first production model after the prototype, really set a standard for the ranch-style house in California, where it first cropped up, and Arizona, and New Mexico, and later across the country. Single-story living. One very interesting influence is in the Tennessee Valley Authority, when they were building temporary worker housing to put on site at Norris Dam, which was in the middle of nowhere at the time. Those houses that they built in Sheffield, Alabama, and put on barges to take up the river look like miniature versions of this house here. And if you go to the newspaper office in town or an architect's office or many newer houses, you see many of the features of this house: a carport, radiant heating, glass meeting glass in a corner, the kind of roof levels with clear stories. You see that again and again and again as what helps define what American architecture is. This house is built of materials of this place. The bricks were made in Decatur. Cypress is a wood rare to the rest of the United States, but indigenous to this area. So while it is a universal house of American origin, it is also a particular house of this place, and that's what makes it so special.
And since the children were all boys, we got a dormitory for the 4 children, putting them into one room when they were young. It was another room equivalent to the size of this living room, but it was their playroom. And as they grew older, we put them into the other bedrooms. Beside the dormitory, we had another kitchen, a laundry, a breakfast room, and a long hall going down to a guest room, which gave us another bedroom and a bathroom. Well, it was certainly adequate, and the boys, as they got older, got their own rooms. The walls do not support the roof. As the concrete went down with a heating system underneath it, then the brick structures went up for the fireplaces. The fireplace over the piano, which opens up into the study behind it. As that went up, and the fireplace in this living room, which went up, has steel as it came to this lowest ceiling, steel from there to there. And then another roof was put up to that, and the space between is a system of clear stories throughout the house. Incidentally, the motif of the design of the clear stories in the house and the lighting fixtures is the same. It's like a running motif of music that runs throughout the house. And in the addition, we have the repetition of the same idea. The repetition is just a continuation of the same aspects of the original house, which was built, the addition was put on 8 years later, 1948. Now, the boards and battens of the walls and are part of the cabinet structure and the shelves all over the house, and I'll explain about that. The middle part of the walls is plywood, and on either side of that is very thin insulation. And the 11-inch boards and 1.5 or 2 inches battens, they're screwed through the battens into the battens are screwed into the core of the wall, which is the plywood, on the inside and outside, and it forms a space about this wide. And so the walls are not only to enclose us from the outside, but also are structured to be part of the function of the house. My husband and I would invariably wonder what would happen one night that the kids would get up in the middle of the night with screwdrivers and undo the house, because the house is not put together with nails, it's screws, brass screws.
We're at the back of the house. Actually, Frank Lloyd Wright called this the front of the house. because it faced the river and its back is kind of turned to the street. This is where the house is open. You see the glass, and it's the part that, as I said, faced the river, which we could see years ago. The vegetation and trees now block the view.
I'm certainly no Wright scholar, but it seems to me that the Rosenbaum house gives us a great picture of the pure form of one of Mr. Wright's best designs. I love the intimacy of the scale and the way that the house fits into the land. And while we don't have any other houses that are like the Rosenbaum house, it's really a unique house in Alabama. There are a lot of things that are in that house that we can certainly see. A carport, the lack of the front porch, the low slung, close to the ground kind of profile that it makes. It doesn't have a hip roof like the prairie style houses, but I think that you can see those kinds of influences in a lot of residential development in the 50s and the 60s and even into the 70s in Alabama. As far as his early work is concerned, many of Wright's early houses really resembled the craftsman houses that we find a great deal in Birmingham. An emphasis on natural materials, the horizontal lines, a broad overhanging eave, which not only in the Midwest hugged that house to the prairie, but here in the South shaded our windows from the hot summer sun, really made for a very comfortable interior. On the interior, we certainly have a lot of wonderful houses with beamed ceilings and built-in bookcases, pressed terracotta fireplaces, or big stone or brick fireplaces. You find these kinds of houses all over Alabama, and certainly in Birmingham, an area that has developed about the same time that Mr. Wright's architecture began to be popular, so you see a lot of that here.
The 1919 Mason house behind us, as I mentioned, was patterned very closely after a 1907 Frank Lloyd Wright design. Some of the characteristics of that design are the extremely wide roof overhangs. They're about 5 feet wide. This is to bring the house down to the earth and give a sheltering feel. Shelter was one of his favorite words. And you notice that the edge of the roof is cut on a slant. That's a Frank Lloyd Wright device to break out the box. Another way he broke out the box, there's a bank of windows in the center that comes out, sort of like a bay window. The banks of the rows of windows are another Frank Lloyd Wright device. The offset over at the corner to demonstrate that this is where the entry is another device. The standing seam metal roof with the big ridges, I'm sure that's the original roof on this house, was a type that he used very frequently. The things that are not like Wright are it's painted white with black trim, and Wright used earth tone colors. And it has essentially a front porch where Wright had a pergola that went off to one side. This is the Jeremiah Murphy house in Huntsville, 1921. And this is not, as you might first guess, an example of the Frank Lloyd Wright style, if there is such a term, but this is more of an example of the Prairie School style. There were many architects in the Midwest in particular working in the Prairie School style. This house has a heavier feel than what Wright would have done, in particular the heavy columns on the front porch, but it also has a lot of the features that Wright and other Prairie School architects use. It has the extremely wide roof overhangs, the floating planes of the roof, and it uses earth tones. The brick is a tan brick and the trim is a dark brown, which would have been the original color. And any color on it is an earth tone. The base is stone, which is a sandstone. So while this has many characteristics of Frank Lloyd Wright's style, it is heavier and is more characteristic of another Prairie School architect named Walter Burley Griffin, who had a heavier style than Wright. This was designed by an architect from California, whose name we have unfortunately lost in history, but it is a nice example of the Prairie School style. An interesting technical feature of the house is if you look up under the broad roof overhangs, you will see a grid of star-shaped pieces of wood. This grid is open except for some insect screen, and it totally surrounds the roof of the house. The ceiling is below the grid inside. This is called an umbrella roof, and it's particularly suited for hot climates because in the hot weather it allows the wind, a breeze, or whatever air movement to go completely through the top of the house above the ceiling, and thus acts like an umbrella in shading a person walking down the sidewalk. This is not a unique feature to the Prairie School style. It's widely used in Hawaii and in the Southwest United States and has been for many, many years. But this is the only example that I have seen in this part of the country.
The preservation of the Rosenbaum house is also at the conjunction of a number of interesting forces. Just as the house was at the very beginning, so too is it now in some ways sort of the centerpiece for a larger set of stories.
Of course, it's an important piece of architecture and associated with Frank Lloyd Wright. It's the only Frank Lloyd Wright house in Alabama and one of the few Frank Lloyd Wright buildings in the South. It's also associated with a very important family in local history, the Rosenbaums. They own the movie theater. That's a building that everybody has an association with. And a really important time in the development of North Alabama with the development of TVA, the Depression, a lot of good social history going on at that time that's important to commemorate too.
I've only recently learned about really how significant this house is in American architecture. An interesting story I recently read comes from Lewis Mumford, who was probably the greatest critic of his era and a great champion of American architecture. He gave a series of lectures at Alabama College, now the University of Montevallo, in 1941, just a few months after this house was built. And the first lecture he gave was on Thomas Jefferson, the architect, and Jefferson's influence on architecture from Greek and Roman architecture, classical architecture. And the second lecture was about an architect named H.H. Richardson, who grew up in New Orleans. And Richardson had, again, many European influences in his architecture, but it was closer to a pure American form. And he eventually went up to New England and practiced architecture in Boston. And the final lecture was on Frank Lloyd Wright. And this was the lecture in which Mumford talked about how Wright was able to combine things that were regional with things that were universal, and how important that was to create a vocabulary for American architecture. And he gave this lecture in Alabama, just as this house was brand new, the first residence in the South by Frank Lloyd Wright.
The Frank Lloyd Wright Conservancy is a group of homeowners, museum operators, curators, and to preserve these buildings from being torn down. Because up until a certain time, so many of these buildings were demolished because they were not in keeping with their present needs. And so this conservancy I have been part of from the very beginning. When we met in 1991, they gave me an award, which was the first time ever award, the Frank Lloyd Wright Spirit Award, which is a bell hanging at the front door, made by Arcosanti, which is not far from Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin in Scottsdale, Arizona.
Most important that we preserve and save this house, and that the story of this house and its importance in American architecture will be a story that'll be heard by students 100 years from now, 200 years from now. So we are working very hard right now to make sure that the stories that are true and real are preserved, and that the house itself is put together in the best possible way for the ages. It will be able to tell us things about ourselves and about America and about American architecture.
About this house, yes, since it is the only expression of Mr. Wright's in Alabama, that it certainly deserves a place here. In the Midwest, there are many houses, and they are being preserved. Some of them are being kept, thanks to the Conservancy. But here, we're way out of the way. There are some buildings in Florida. There are 2 buildings in South Carolina. And there's a building in Jackson, Mississippi. But other than that, there are very few in the Southeast. And this is a good representation, and we've kept it to the letter.
Production of this program was made possible in part by the Alabama Architectural Foundation. The Alabama State Council on the Arts, and by KPS Group.